Welcome to Restoring the Mind. My name is Khalid Mahmood, and today my guest is William Anthony Harris. He is a developmental neurobiologist. He specializes in brain development during the embryo stage. He has written a book titled Zero to Birth about how the brain is built. Welcome to Restoring the Mind, Bill.
Thank you very much, Khalid. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, Bill, let's start with yourself first. Tell me about yourself. How did you become interested in brain development? The journey from what you can call it cell biology to brain development. How did the idea for this book, how the brain develops from conception to birth and beyond, come about? How did you get here?
Yes, if we go back to early days when I was in college, I I was very interested in the field of genetics. I was very interested in the field of neurobiology, and I did my PhD at Caltech in the laboratory of Seymour Benzer, who was studying behavior in Drosophila fruit flies and finding mutants that affected behavior. The way these mutants work is they affect genes, and most of the or many of the mutations that affected behaviors in flies affected the development of the fly's brain. So I started to get into, uh, you know, started to get interested in questions about how these genes work, what do they do, how does the nervous system develop. And then as a postdoc, I went to Harvard Medical School and worked with David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel on the question of visual development in cats, and then I switched to visual development in salamanders. So I've moved to different organisms, and then I worked when I got a faculty job. I started working with frogs, frog development, and then finally, in the last phase of my career, I was working on the development of the visual system in fish embryos. So the reason to work in frogs and salamanders and fish is because the embryos develop outside the mother, so they're easily accessible. And the stages of development that I was working on were very early embryonic stages.
Okay. How did you end up with the working with the human brain then?
Oh, I've never worked with a human brain.
Okay. Okay.
I wrote the book. The book is about the human brain because many of the findings from
They
animal work and cell
can be
work,
applied in this case as well.
yes, and have been checked out, to say, okay, does this thing that we see in frogs, does it happen in humans? Does it happen in a similar way? So a lot of those things that are in the book have been checked out in that kind of way
Right.
by
It,
others.
for my next question, I'm actually going to quote a paragraph from your book, and then question actually is also from the book as well.
Okay.
Okay. The question is that as birth approaches, growth slows down as increasingly more of these cells turn into neurons. By birth, neuron production is complete in almost every region of the brain. How does this happen? How is the growth of the brain and all its regions controlled so precisely?
You want me to? Well, that's the that's the topic of chapter 3, and certainly we don't know all the answers,
Mhm.
but different animals have different size brains. Humans have a very large cerebral cortex. So the question is, how does a human get a very large cerebral cortex compared to a mouse or even a chimpanzee? And the answer, as we know it, which isn't a full answer, is when you're building a cellular structure, you need more cells. So to build a cellular structure of, say, 8 cells, you might take one cell and it would divide into 2. Those 2 cells would divide into 4. Those 4 cells would divide into 8, and those 8 cells would then mature into, say, neurons, and then you'd have a brain with 8 neurons. So now you have to just kind of expand that up till you have close to 100 billion neurons.
Mm-hmm.
So the population of progenitor cells, that is the ancestors of neurons, the cells that divide and divide and divide again, go through enough rounds of division to make all the neurons in our brains.
You also wrote that the certain cells actually, kill themselves basically, or commit, kind of, and they die. They choose to die, and
Yes,
you wrote the question, and I'm quoting yourself here with the question again.
yes.
How do cells choose their fate?
Including the fate of death.
Yes.
Yes. Well, that is that's what we've got in chapter 4. So when a cell is born in the brain as a neuron, it will be born in a specific part, a region of the brain. Say it might be born in the forebrain, or it might be born in the spinal cord. If it's born in the ventral region of the spinal cord, it may be a motor neuron. If it's a motor neuron, then it might have to choose which muscle it's going to make a connection with so it can excite that muscle. So there's a sequence of events where cells find they're born in a particular region, they're exposed to certain influences, which tells them which fate to become, to be this type of cell or that type, this type of neuron or that type of neuron, doing this job in the brain or that job in the brain, with this shape or that shape, making connections with those other cells or these other cells. So there's every neuron in the brain has got, many others that it's connected to. It's processing information and sending out information, processing information that comes in from many other cells and sending out information that's going to many other cells. So each neuron is doing a particular job. So how does a neuron get that particular job? That's the title of chapter. I mean, that's the question that we deal with in chapter 4, and it's about genetics. So which genes are turned on? It's about influences. So maybe hormones or morphogens or gradients of factors influence the fate of a neuron. And it's a bit about chance too, because it's a bit unpredictable if you follow a particular cell, what it will become. One doesn't, the scientists have not been able to, figure it out. And it looks like the cells are rolling dice just a little bit. So they could become A or B. Some of them become A, some of them become B. So those 3 things, genes, environment, and chance, all influence the fate of a cell. Now, once a cell has got a fate, it knows it's going to be a certain cell, then it has to compete with other types of the same type of cell, and only some of them will survive. And the ones that survive are the ones that are making the best connections generally. So imagine you're choosing a team, and you get lots of people trying out for the team, and you select the best people for the team. So you have the strongest team, and you cut the other ones. Well, that's what the neurons do themselves. They kind of see who's making the better connections, and about half of them make good enough connections to survive, and about half of them don't, and they commit suicide, cellular suicide, by a process called apoptosis, where they digest themselves, basically. So you end up with a brain that has only good players on it, a brain team that has basically full of good players, and the players that didn't quite make it, that weren't good enough, were eliminated.
Then that kind of, I still want to stay with this question about fate, and
Sure.
that is kind of I've been pondering about quite a lot,
Okay.
because there is all these children that are born with certain conditions, okay,
Certainly.
and for example autism,
Yes.
okay, and who chooses the fate? I mean, no, and secondly, I mean, this these cells, okay, and these neurons, I mean, how do they kind of uh, where do they fate? I mean, is the fate written in that originally from the sperm and the egg? Is everything in that written in that the egg and the I mean, how much of it is coming from and the other external sources like the womb itself, or from the mother's genetics? Is that coming from the blood from the mother side, or is that all in the egg? I mean, where is this so much information coming from?
Yeah. It's I can see why you're pondering it. So imagine a sperm and an egg, and
Hmm.
they get together. They have uh, human. It's a human sperm and a human egg, and when it's fertilized, this egg becomes a human embryo.
Okay.
And in the DNA of that egg, and the egg then starts to divide, and all the cells have a full set of all the genes. They have all the chromosomes.
Okay.
So, and every cell is a human cell. And as that embryo develops, it will, if it's in the right permissive conditions, make a human embryo, a human being with a human brain. Whereas if you started off with a monkey sperm and a monkey egg, it would make a monkey, and it would have a monkey's brain. So, first of all, you think, okay, well, the instructions are probably written in the DNA mostly. But without a womb, of course, that egg isn't going to develop at all. Or if the mother is abusing drugs, maybe that's going to affect the way the embryo develops. Or if there's an accident and something happens, maybe that will affect the way the embryo develops. Or if there's, there's starvation, that will affect the way the embryo develops. Um, so lots of influences that are coming through the mother, nutritional influences, hormonal influences, diseases, can affect the way the embryo develops in the womb. And then again, as I said, there's a little bit of lady luck that's playing a game too. So one can't predict exactly, you know, even if you've got identical twins in the same womb, their brains won't be exactly the same. They may have pretty much identical genetics and a pretty much identical environment, not perfectly identical. Um, but there's also likelihood that random differences, random processes in development um, affect the way that different parts of the brain develop.
Okay, I mean, you kind of mentioned just now as well about, for example, malnourished or and if they're underdeveloped, the mothers themselves are kind of not somehow not getting the good environment,
Mhm.
enriched environment, and the baby would be kind of similarly affected by that. What
Yes,
about these the traumas, the psychological traumas? Do
the,
they kind of not have a long-term impact as well?
they may not enough work has been done. It's been suggested that there's these epigenetic changes,
Hmm.
so not changes in the sequence of the DNA, but small chemical groups that can get added onto the DNA or added onto the proteins that wrap around the DNA that affect the way genes nearby are expressed. So if a mother has a traumatic event and she has a baby inside her, and there's a whoosh of hormones or something that goes through the mother because of this traumatic event, or there's a lack of some important vitamin because of this traumatic event, that can affect the way the genes in the embryo are expressed later on. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah. Next question. It is well documented that the brain has a certain amount of electricity. Can you shed some light on this phenomena? How electricity is generated in the brain?
Yeah, that is a question best answered by an electrophysiologist. But the
Okay.
basic idea is that in the membranes of neurons, there are channels, little proteins that have holes in the center through which ions carrying electric charge can move from one side of the membrane to the other. Ions can flow into the cell, ions can flow out of the cell. And as ions move in or move out of the cell, they change the voltage difference between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. So you consider the cell like a little battery,
Mhm.
because the cell is constantly pumping in ions and pumping out ions, and it has an electrical potential across the membrane. So when a neuron gets excited, some of these channels in the membrane are sensitive to the voltage change across the membrane. So if the cell gets a little bit excited, it opens up more channels, and those extra channels that are open allow more ions to flow through, and it changes the potential of the cell even more until you get a little explosion of electricity in the membrane, and that travels along the processes of the cell to at a very fast rate. So
Okay.
compared to hormones, which circulate in your blood and get from one place in your body to another rather slowly, electrical activity through neurons and their processes can travel much faster. That's why, someone who's a professional baseball player can see a ball and hit it, can react that quickly.
Okay. Actually, you mentioned about epilepsy in the book, so that's why I wanted to kind of
Mhm.
look into the electricity side of things. Uh,
Yeah,
Next question.
epilepsy. You want me to say
No,
something
no,
about
no,
that?
no, no. Actually, next question is about the sleep. How important is sleep for the brain? The infants spend a lot of time sleeping. What is going on in the baby's brain during sleep?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We have no real idea. Before, at early stages of embryonic development, you probably wouldn't call it sleep, because what people call sleep is, certain types of brain waves, um, certain kinds of activity, and a baby's brain wouldn't develop that probably until like the third trimester sometime, I'm guessing. But there is activity in the brain before a baby is born. So neurons are connecting up and signals are flowing through the brain. There's activity going on. You wouldn't say that these babies are awake and conscious at this early stage, but in um, late in pregnancy, um, babies probably do have awake periods inside the womb and sleep periods inside the womb. And what they're dreaming about, I don't know. Now, the other question you ask is, why do babies and children sleep in general more than adults? That's a really good question. And I don't know the answer to it, but, I'm thinking that here's a baby and it spends a lot of its time sleeping, and in the womb, it was never conscious of the external world, may have been awake for a little bit. So something is happening to the brain when it's asleep, because if you deprive an animal of sleep, it will die.
True.
People are guessing now. They're thinking, well, sleep has a role in adjusting synapses in the brain and maybe in memory. And if you don't get enough sleep, you don't adjust your synapses properly, you'd go crazy and die.
Okay.
That's
A similar question, kind
yep.
of again. You
Yep.
mentioned in the book that the babies recognize native languages, maybe because they heard it while in the womb. So, what kind of learning takes place while the fetus or the baby is still in the womb?
Well, a baby can hear things in the womb. There are cases, I think, particularly of musicians, of babies whose mothers played the cello and things like that, where they recognize a song that their mother played while they were in the womb. And it seems that when babies are born, they can already, to a certain extent, recognize the voices that they heard most, their mother's voice, when they were in the womb. So it's probably late in development when the auditory system is more developed. Babies then begin to hear the mother's voice and rhythm of speech, and that helps tune the circuitry of the developing auditory system.
Okay. Bill, this is off the wall question. You've probably heard of Neuralink. It's a company co-founded by Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And Musk proposes to implant chips directly to the brain and connect it to the computer. How do you see the future of this idea of technology connecting to the brain? How viable is the idea, and what are its implications in your view as a neuroscientist and neurobiologist?
Yeah, I think that there's a usefulness in putting some kind of device in or on the brain that can read what's going on in the brain to a certain extent and use it to control a machine. So a brain-machine interface. This is particularly useful in people that have, say, lost the ability to move. Maybe they got paralyzed. Now, if they can think of how to walk, and you've got a chip in the brain that can sense that the person is trying to walk, maybe it could activate a pair of machine legs or a wheelchair that they're in to move the wheelchair. It's going to be quite crude at first, but it is helpful for patients who, say, have lost the ability to act, or maybe it could be useful for someone who's gone blind as an adult, if there could be a sophisticated enough chip to put into the brain that's connected to a video camera that could give the visual cortex some sense of a scene in front. So people are trying these experiments. It's I can see it's pretty useful for patients. I don't see why it would be any good for a normal person. If you can walk, why not walk? If you can, see something, why not open your eyes and see it?
True. What? Okay. How do you see the future of the human brain? I mean, if you look at it from the evolutionary point of view, I mean, what's next for the Homo sapien?
I don't know. I suppose the brain the brain evolves through, I believe, an evolutionary process that's kind of Darwinian. So human brains worked out well for human beings. They haven't changed much in terms of their shape since the origin of Homo sapiens. Skull sizes are the same, and it looks like the cortex is pretty much look the same because the brain cases of early Homo sapiens look very similar to the brain cases of modern Homo sapiens. So where we will go in the future, I don't know. I'm sorry. I would like to know that.
One final question, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And this is probably just going to uh, be a little bit surprising for you, right? There's
Okay.
should I not
Go for it.
go for it? Okay, there's the whole no book, the Quran, Islamic religious book. Okay,
Okay.
and one of the chapters, chapter number 22, and the verse number 5. Right, I'm going to read the verse to you, and I would like your reaction to that. Right, it says, "O humanity, if you are in doubt about resurrection, then know that we did create you from dust, and then from a sperm drop, and then developed you into a clinging clot of blood, then a lump of flesh, fully formed and unformed, in order to demonstrate our power to you. Then we settle whatever embryo we will in the womb for an appointed term, then bring you forth as infants, so that you may reach your prime. Some of you may die young, while others are left to reach the most feeble stage of life, so that they may know nothing after they have known much. And you see the earth lifeless. But as soon as we send down rain upon it, it begins to stir to life and swell, producing every type of pleasant plant. I mean, this thing about the stages of pregnancy, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'll repeat the part I read earlier. We did create you from dust and from a sperm drop. So that's, it starts off. Then it developed you into a clinging clot of blood, then a lump of flesh, fully formed and unformed, in order to demonstrate our power to you. I mean, these are the different stages, but the science has only told us about it very recently, on the last maybe 100, 200 years. And I think you have mentioned exactly the same things in the book, that we only discovered these things about 100, 200 years ago. But this book was written more than 1400 years ago.
Yes, I I appreciate that. I think there's a lot of truth in the sentiment in the Quran, the scientific um, basis and understanding of it at that time was not understood. So the work that's been done in the last 200 years is not so much a discovery, a rediscovery of what was said in the Quran, but it is a research into the biological basis of how that happens. So we do start off as a single egg, and in that egg is, our whole evolutionary history as human beings. The genes that were evolved in that started way back at the beginning of life uh, are part of our DNA. And yeah, then we build an embryo, and the embryo isn't doing much yet. And the embryo finally builds up a person, a baby. The baby's born with a brain that functions and is well connected up. And then experience can help mold that brain to learn new things about the world outside. But those things were probably known for thousands of years, or yeah, many thousands of years. But how they happened, and the biological mechanisms, the genes involved, the processes involved, the neurons involved, and how they develop and change has only been discovered more recently.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. Okay. I think more or less run out of questions. Would you like to kind of tell the audience how they can actually read your writings and everything, and how and where they can find the book, and the Zero to Birth book?
Yeah, the book is called Zero to Birth: How the Human Brain is Built, and it's published by Princeton University Press.
And when is it going to be available to the public?
It is available in the States and Canada now, but I think we have to wait until mid-July before it's published in the UK.
Okay. I was sent an advance copy by the publishers, so I have already read it, and it's a quite a astonishing book, very well written and very informative.
Thank
And
you.
if anybody can actually get access to the book, I say definitely go and read it. Definitely go and buy the book and read it. And I want to thank you, Bill, for your very informative interview, and look forward to your next work, and look forward to interviewing you again.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.